History has shown us that one of the most damaging beliefs we can hold is the assumption that one group of people is inherently better than another group of people. Well, in today's story, I'm going to tell you about two young men who latched onto this belief system and the horrific crimes that they committed as a result. On the evening of May 21st, 1924, a businessman named Jacob Franks approached his mansion in Chicago after a long day of work. Jacob was incredibly successful. He was president of a men's watch company, and at the time, he was worth about $4 million. Just to put that in perspective, that'd be about $70 million today. Jacob was particularly excited to get home this evening because today was the day that he'd agreed with his wife to finally pull the trigger on a European vacation that the two had been talking about for years. They both agreed that this night they would call the travel agency and finally book the tickets. But when Jacob opened the door, he saw his wife and he read her expression. He immediately realized that she was in absolutely no mood to talk about the vacation. Flora was so upset because their 14-year-old son Bobby hadn't returned home from school yet. Now, it was only 6 p.m., and Bobby often stayed out late with his friends, so Jacob's first expression was to be pretty annoyed. Flora had this tendency to over-worry about just about anything. But by 11 p.m., Jacob had changed his tune a little bit because Bobby still hadn't come home from school. He left the house and began combing through the neighborhood looking for any trace of his son. His first stop was at a neighbor's house. The house was owned by the Loeb family. Richard was the oldest son in the family, and he was actually pretty close friends with Bobby. Richard was 4 years older, but the two bonded over a shared interest in tennis, and they would frequently play the game together. Richard had just returned home from a double date with his other friend, Nathan Leopold, and their two girlfriends. As Jacob began explaining the situation with Bobby, Richard became immediately concerned. The last he'd heard was Bobby had officiated a baseball game at his high school, but that baseball game ended around 4 p.m., so he certainly should have been home by this point. The two searched around the rest of the neighborhood and asked anyone who walked by if they'd seen any sign of Bobby, but they just got a lot of blank stares. And you also have to remember that this was in a time before cell phones, so it's not like Jacob could just call his son or text him and see where he was at. They literally had to track him down and find him. Jacob and Richard even walked all the way to Bobby's high school and combed through that baseball diamond where the game had happened a few years earlier, but with no sign of him there, Jacob returned home just praying that Bobby had made it and he was back at home with his wife. But when he opened the door again, Flora's terrified expression told him everything that he needed to know. With no choice, the couple finally went to bed and attempted to sleep around 1 a.m., praying, pleading that they would see their son in the morning. The only clue they found in the morning, though, made things much worse. At around 10 a.m., a letter arrived. The first line of that letter said, "Hello, your son has been kidnapped, but I assure you he is safe." The letter then went on to demand $10,000 from Jacob in exchange for their son, and it also warned him to not notify the police lest anything terrible happened to Bobby. Now, $10,000 was a pittance of money to a successful man like Jacob, so upon reading the letter, he immediately phoned up his bank and instructed them to assemble the cash as fast as they possibly could. But he also wasn't an idiot, so in spite of the warning on the note, he did notify the police secretly so that they could begin an investigation. An hour later, Jacob was pacing back and forth through his living room, wondering what he should do next, and his phone rang. It was a man who called himself George Johnson. Johnson instructed Jacob to take the cash and meet him behind a drugstore in town. But Jacob never did go to the drugstore because shortly after this call with the kidnapper, he received another call from police with horrific news. 4 years earlier, in 1920, two young men named Morten Ballard and Louis Mason met at a party in Chicago. The two were both extremely intelligent individuals. They both came from wealthy families, spoke multiple languages, and had graduated college several years early. Just to give you an idea of how wealthy these families were, Morton's father gifted him with a customized 9-hole golf course just as a graduation present. As the two chatted at the party that night, they quickly bonded over a shared interest in philosophy and also crime. The two young men began spending more and more time together, both in social gatherings like parties, but also one-on-one too. They studied philosophy more and crime cases, but the more time they spent together, they realized that they weren't just interested in studying crime. They actually wanted to start committing crimes together. It started very small, petty things like shoplifting, but the thrill of that very quickly wore off. They took things up a notch when they raided and robbed a local fraternity at a university, but on the drive home, they both just weren't that excited. The robbery only netted them a typewriter and $80, and for guys who came from such wealthy families, this was a meaningless amount of money. In response to this lack of excitement, Morten suggested that they up the stakes even further. Morten and Louis were both fans of the 19th century German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. In one of his books, Nietzsche talks about this concept of Übermensch, or supermen, and I'm not talking about the type of supermen with capes that fly around and get killed by kryptonite. Nietzsche was referring to a group of intellectually superior men who, because of their intelligence, are greater than everyone else in society, and they're not liable to the same rules and laws that everyone else should follow. If this philosophy sounds familiar, it's because it's the same concept that Hitler and the Nazis used as the foundation for their horrific regime that would start just 15 years later. Morten and Louis became engrossed with this concept, absolutely obsessed with it. Because of their extreme intelligence, both of them believed that they were part of this Übermensch level of society, and in order to prove this to themselves, they came up with this sinister plot to murder a random victim and plan the crime so well that they would never be caught and no one would know who did it. They went through a rigorous 7-month planning phase, and when they felt the time was finally right, on the afternoon of May 21st, 1924 at 2 p.m., the two of them arrived at a car dealership and rented a vehicle. By 4:15 that day, Morten and Louis still hadn't found their victim. They were driving around a rich neighborhood in Chicago when they spotted a young boy, about 14 years old or so, walking home from his high school. Morten actually happened to know this boy quite well, and he was driving the car, so he stopped, rolled his window down, and began speaking to the boy. The two chatted about tennis for a couple of minutes, and when the conversation came to a natural end, Morten offered to give the boy a ride for the rest of the way home. It was only about a quarter mile or so, but the boy was really tired after his day at school, so he agreed. He opened up one of the car doors and sat in the back seat beside Louis Mason. He started to ask Morten another question, but before he could finish his sentence, Louis wrapped an arm around the boy's neck, pulled out a chisel, and began stabbing the boy in the top of the head over and over again. Finally, the boy collapsed, moaning in agony. Afraid that the moans would alert people nearby, Louis grabbed a handkerchief out of his pocket and stuffed it down the boy's throat to keep him quiet. He then threw him in the trunk of the car and slammed it shut. The two drove outside of town to a deserted area with some old railway tracks where they planned to finish the job. But when they opened up the trunk, the boy had already died. He had suffocated on the handkerchief that had been stuffed down his throat. They stuffed the body in a culvert underneath the railway tracks and drove back to the city that night as if nothing had happened. Now, the two young men didn't know it at the time, but just a few feet down the railway tracks from where the boys had stuffed the body was a break that needed to be repaired. The next morning, a railway construction worker was dispatched to that same area in order to repair this. As he was getting his tools organized, the construction worker noticed something in the culvert, and as he approached it closer, he realized with a sickening feeling that this was a human body. Police were on the scene just 2 hours later, and they very quickly identified the body as Bobby Franks. Bobby's father, Jacob, was quickly called with this news, and that's why he never showed up to the drugstore. As police combed through this murder scene, they happened to notice a pair of reading glasses on the ground very close to the body. Assuming that the murderers wouldn't be so careless, the police assumed that the reading glasses belonged to Bobby, but when they questioned Jacob about this, he explained that Bobby never wore reading glasses, not a single time in his life. And that's where things started to get interesting. Upon further investigation, it was discovered that these reading glasses were extremely rare. So rare, in fact, that only 3 pairs had ever been manufactured in history. Police traveled to the retail outlet that sold these glasses, and they were able to track the owners of all 3 of the pairs. The first pair belonged to an old lady who still had hers. The second pair belonged to a lawyer who was traveling in Europe at that time. And the third pair belonged to none other than Louis Mason. When police paid a visit to the home of Louis the next day, they knocked on the door, Louis answered it, and they asked him if he wore reading glasses. Louis responded, "Well, no sir, I don't." And that little white lie changed everything. Police, of course, knew that this wasn't true. They had the record, the bill of sale that Louis Mason's parents had bought these reading glasses for him a year earlier, and that lie made him the lead suspect for the murder of Bobby Franks. Upon further investigation, a salesman at a car rental agency recognized a picture of Louis Mason. A night watchman happened to notice an object thrown out of that same rental car later that night, which happened to be a bloody chisel. Another witness happened to see two young men whose descriptions matched pictures of Louis and Morten walking around the railway area where Bobby's body was found. But the final nail in the coffin came from Morten's butler. He thought he was helping the situation when he agreed to testify to police and assured them that Morten couldn't have committed this crime because the family vehicle had never left the driveway that night. You see, the false alibi that these two young men crafted and repeatedly told police was that the night Bobby was murdered, they were out on the town on a double date with their girlfriends in Morten's family car. Now, if that alibi about being on a double date sounds familiar, it's because Morten Ballard wasn't the young man's real name. He was actually Bobby's good friend, Richard Loeb. As a part of this murder plan, in order to prevent themselves being caught, the two had crafted these false identities to protect themselves. Both Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold were found guilty of the murder of Bobby Franks, and they were sentenced to life in prison. While in prison, Richard was murdered by his cellmate in 1936. Nathan never got over the loss of his good friend, but in later years in prison, he did appear to get remorseful for the things that he'd done. He found religion through the prison's chaplains, and after multiple attempts, he was finally granted parole in 1958. He moved to Puerto Rico, got married, and died in 1971 at the age of 66. Thanks for listening.